So in this video, we're gonna continue where we left off on the previous video about creating a more complicated example of a Gutenberg block. This is part 4 of a video series about creating the Gutenberg block. If you haven't watched the previous videos, please go back and watch them and then come back, especially the last one, the video number 3, because we set up the environment that we need to develop this block that we're gonna do now. So at least watch that one if you haven't already watched it, and then come back to this one. So in this video, what we're going to do is start the development of the block. And the block we're going to build here, it's going to be a grid that is going to have cards inside. It's going to have any number of cards. We're going to provide a control to set up the number of cards that the grid is going to display. And each card is going to display text that can be aligned to the left, to the right, and center. So we're going to start with that. It sounds simple, but there's a lot that we can cover with that example. Also, there's a distinction between dynamic blocks and static blocks, and that's an important distinction. This grid block that we're going to develop is a static block. Static blocks are blocks which contents are written into the post content surrounded by a comment with the name of the block. We already saw that in the first example that we created, the very simple Hello World example in the first 2 videos. This block is also gonna be dumped into the post content because it's a static block. Dynamic blocks, on the other hand, are blocks that fetch content, fetch data from, for example, a REST API, so the content cannot be written into the post content because that's going to be fetched at, let's call it runtime, or when we load the block both on the editor or on the front end, or maybe we can do it only on the front end and show some static like a placeholder in the back end. Anyway, that's going to be a decision, a development decision, design decision anyway. But this is going to be a static block, but we're going to cover a lot with this. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is give it a name better than this, which is the default name. So let's say Hello World block / cards grid. We're gonna use a title. Let's just say cards grid. An icon right now it's shield. I'm just gonna leave that one because we're not gonna care about that right now. And then we have the edit function and the save function. So just to make sure this is working, I am gonna remove all this and write just a paragraph. That's grid cards. Now another thing that we need to do is run the Webpack. So the Webpack, if you remember, is going to take all the code that we write in JSX and all sorts and SAS for our style sheets, and it's going to compile them into normal CSS and into plain old JavaScript. So we need to run that. So I'm going to cd into the plugin folder, and I'm going to run npm start. That's going to start the Webpack process that is going to compile my files, and then it's going to wait for changes. And every time I change either a SAS file or a JS file, it's going to compile them and transform them and dump them into the dist folder. The other thing I need to do is make sure that the plugin that we just created is activated. So I'm going to go ahead and activate it. Now we're going to have our block available. The last thing I'm going to do is go back into the code and the init PHP. I'm going to change this line. I'm going to uncomment it. So now it's not commented, and that is gonna add the timestamp of the file update date, because I want WordPress to reload the JS files when I change it. So I'm gonna uncomment that, and now we're all set. Now we can go back here and create a new post. And now I'm gonna add the cards grid, and there we go. We have the grids card paragraph that we added. So now that we know that's working, I'm gonna come here, I'm gonna delete this, and we're gonna create a grid. Now for that, I'm gonna use div, and I'm gonna create a bunch of divs inside. Oops. Let's say 3. And I'm gonna say, let's say cell 1, cell 2, cell 3 of the grid. I'm gonna ask a class, the class name grid. And when I save this file, Webpack is running. It doesn't show us anything here, but it's running in the background and creating the new plugin, sorry, the new block file. So now I'm going to delete this. I'm going to reload. Actually, I'm going to publish it, so I don't have to deal with the auto saves. And then I'm going to reload the page and add the block again. Actually, we have a shorthand here with the most used blocks, so we can just click on that, and there we have our grid. It doesn't look like a grid though, so we're gonna give it some style just to make sure that's working too. I'm gonna go to the editor, CSS. I'm gonna delete this old CSS code, and we're gonna add some code to display grids. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna do it in the style CSS because I want the grid to show us a grid both on the front end and the back end. So I'm gonna do it here. For that, we're gonna use grid, and we're gonna use the display grid property. Then we're gonna say that grid template columns is repeat auto fit max of 100 in 1 frame. So it's gonna go down. Each cell is gonna go shrink down to 100 pixels minimum, and maximum is gonna be 1 frame. Now I'm going to use grid gap just to give it a nice spacing between the cells of 10 pixels. We might change that in the future. Let's see how this looks now. So that's done. CSS file has been compiled. Now I'm going to remove this, reload the page, and load the block again. Okay, it doesn't work. Let's inspect this and see what's going on. Here we have the grid class. No style is being applied to those. I wonder why. Let's see. There are no errors here. We have that. Display grid. That looks about right. Let's come here and add the timestamp to the style sheets too. Maybe it's a caching problem. Let's see. Let's reload this page. Oops. It's in a comma here. There we go. 1. Let's take this one out. There we go. Let's add the block. Do you have some style in here? Yes. Okay, oh. There we go. There's an extra I in there. Let's go back here. So we had a caching problem and a CSS problem. That's min max. There we go. So now we're all set. Now, what we want to do when we're creating a more complicated block, and this also applies for all general React development, is we want to have our components separated in components, of course. So what we're going to do is create a new folder. We're going to call it components, and we're going to start separating our structure, our block structure, into different components that we can actually reuse when we're developing other blocks or within the same block. So what I'm going to do is create a new file here. We're going to call it grid.js. This is going to be our grid component. If you're familiar with React development, this is going to be very easy for you. If you're not familiar with React development, then this is going to be a little bit strange. But I'm going to try to cover at least the basics so you can get a general sense of it. So the first thing that we're going to use is import React. So you're going to do import React from React. The next thing that we're going to do is create a class, or we could be doing a function, but let's do a class. So we're going to create a class, and this is ES6 syntax. So usually we can use the keyword class to create a class. Usually we use a function for that, but as we're using ES6, we can use a class, and then Webpack is going to convert that into the old JS syntax. So we're going to create a new class called grid, and that is going to extend React.component. Another way to write this that I particularly like better would be to import also component from React and just write component here. It looks cleaner to me. And this component, for now, is just going to have one function that's called render. And that function is going to return what we have now as a grid. I'm using brackets because, or parentheses, because I want to use a new line. If I do this and I return something here, that's going to give me an error. So we need to use parentheses for that. And I'm going to copy this, take that out of there, and paste it in there. So this is our grid. And here, what I'm going to do is just go up here and import a grid from components grid. Now this is actually not going to work. Why not? Because grid is not exposing anything to the outside of this module. So what I'm going to do is add here export default. This is going to expose the grid out of the module, and here we're going to be able to import that. Since we're exporting this class by default, what I'm going to get here as grid is that class, which is a component. Since it's a component, I can use it as a tag, so to speak. So I can say grid here and auto closet, or like that. That's the same. I'm gonna save. I'm gonna come here. I'm gonna test this, and we should see the same. Actually, I'm gonna change some of this just to make sure that this is actually changing. I'm gonna reload the page. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna update. Reload the page. Remove this block and add it. oops, we have an error. Module build fail. Okay, so we should be getting an error here. There's something wrong about our syntax, and is that extend component unexpected token comma. Let's see if we can spot that one. It should be extends. Now it's compiling. We come here. Let's remove this. Update. Reload the page. And add the block again. Now it says new cell. So we're sure that this is the new code. So this is working. Now, this looks very, very static. So what we're going to do is create another component that is going to be our card component. I'm going to import React and component from React. We're going to export default class called card that extends component. In here, we're going to have the render function, and we're going to return one of these divs right here. So for now, this is going to be our card. Let's give it a class name. Card. There we go. And now here, we can import, in the grid module, the grid component, we can import card from card. And we're going to render here is a bunch of cards. I'm going to save that. I'm going to come here. Let's update that. Refresh the page. And now we have 4 cards. Now the style is a little bit off. So we should fix that. But I'm not going to focus on that right now. I'm going to keep working on the logic of this, and then we're going to take care of the styles. So the next thing that I'm going to do is actually add some kind of editing field to these cards. I'm going to go to the card component. And here, if you remember from the previous example, from the simple example, we had an editable component called plain text that we could use to actually edit text inside the card. So we're going to use that. Now that component was provided by the WordPress API. So we're going to import it a little bit differently. I'm going to use a constant in plain text to import it from wp.editor. This could also be written as const plain text equals wp.editor dot plain text. But we can use this syntax sugar, so we're going to use it. And I'm going to add a plain text inside the card, just like this. And to prevent it from failing, we need to provide an onChange function. And we're also going to provide a value. So the value right now, I'm going to say it's a string that says hello. And the onChange function, we're going to create an inline function here. It's going to take a value and it's going to console log that value. And what we're doing here is create an inline function. This is the arrow expressions to create functions. Basically, we have the parameters here and then arrow and the body of the function. If it has no brackets, it's going to run this body right here, which is the console log, and the inline function is going to return whatever it's returned by the console log, which is undefined. If we want to have a more complicated body, we can add brackets here and do whatever we want and use a return statement. Right now we don't need any return value, so we're just going to leave it like that. And then we need to close this. Okay. So now let's use 2 cards. We come here. I'm going to refresh the page. And what we have now is 2 cards that have both of them a text that can be edited. Now this hello is not gonna change, but we see down here that we're actually getting the function called. This is just how React works. If we don't change the value that we send to the component, then we're always gonna keep looking, we're always gonna keep getting this value pushed into the plain text component. Our onChange function should get the new value and set it somewhere in the state of this block, and then being pushed back again as a value into the plain text. One option would be to set the value in the state of this component. That would be the React way to do it. Another option would be to fire an action and store the value in some kind of store. That would be the Redux or the Flux way to do it. We're not going to do either of those because with Gutenberg blocks we need to use attributes. So what I'm going to do first is rearrange our components a little bit. I'm going to go back to the block, and what I'm going to do here is import also my card component. And on my grid component, what I'm going to do, instead of hard coding these 2 cards, is render here this .props.children. That means that whatever I send inside or between this open grid and closed grid, whatever I put in here is going to be rendered in here. So basically our grid is nothing else than a wrapping div with a class name. That's the kind of structure that we want to follow when we're developing components. Just having very dummy, very simple, clear, with a clear purpose structures. What I'm going to do here is create a couple of cards. I create one card, create another card. Now our cards have inside this plain text element. What I'm going to do here is say that these cards on change are going to receive a value which is going to be the value of the text editor when it changes, and they're going to do something. Now what are they going to do? What they're going to do for now is just console log something like card 1 has text value, and the other card is going to console log card 2 has text value. Now I need to go to the card component now, and I'm going to be getting an onChange function from this .props. Now if you have no experience with React, this .props is everything we send as an attribute when we write down the block as HTML. So right here I'm defining a property called onChange. If I write here like disabled, I'm going to be getting a property called disabled, which is going to have no value. If I give it a value like 3, I'm going to be having that, or true. Anyway, I'm not going to get deep into that, but basically we're sending a property called onChange. So here I'm receiving that property from this .props, and onChange I'm going to call that function. So onChange, I'm going to do onChange. Notice that I'm not calling it, it's just I'm passing the function. as a value. So let's try this out. Let's refresh this page. Oops, cards is not defined. It's actually because it's called card. Let's check that. Yep. Now let's try again. Okay, now we have the same cards as before, but when I changed, it says card 1 has text. And if I change this one, it says card 2 has text. Good. So now we can identify which card I'm changing. Now it's when this gets a little tricky. What I'm gonna do now, if you remember, is that we're gonna create some attributes. And the attribute is going to allow us to save that information, some information, and that information is going to be pushed into the post content. So I'm going to create the attributes property here. I'll put this comma because it's very easy to forget about this comma. And I'm going to create cards attribute. Now, this is when it gets a little tricky. Right now, we just need to store some information. So I can sort of leave it like this. But after we save the post with information on the card, then we're going to need to parse that post content. Actually, Gutenberg is going to do that for us. But we need to tell Gutenberg what we want from all that post content. So basically, we need to tell Gutenberg how to find the text that belongs to each card. Now, we're not going to do that right now. For now, let's just leave this. And actually, I'm going to give it a default value, which is going to be an array with 2 objects because we're using 2 cards. And in each object, we're going to store a key called content and hello world. Hello world 1 and hello world 2 content. And we're going to load this into the cards by default. So how do we do that? If you remember from the first very simple example, we get the attributes as part of this argument here called props. So I'm going to say to each card, I'm going to create another property called value, or actually let's say content, just to follow the same naming structure. And the content is going to be props dot attributes dot cards, and in the first case is going to be 0 dot content, and in the second case is going to be 1 dot content, and that's this array that we are loading as the default value. That should be working. If we go here to the cards, we accept another prop that it's content, and value is going to be content. Now let's refresh that. And there we go. We have hello world 1, hello world 2. This is our default content. We can change it. This is going to console log, but it's not going to change here because we're always pushing the same value to the plain text component. This is always the same value. We're not changing the attribute yet. That's what we're going to do next. And that's going to be really, really easy. What we're going to do here is for the first card, when we get a new value on change, we're going to do props.set attributes, and here is going to be the same. Now, here gets a little tricky. Now, here we need to pass something like cards is now this value. And here it's going to be the same. Cards is this value. Now, what is that value? That is this array with the value of every single card, but with the value of this particular card changed. So what we're going to do is create another function, and we're going to do it in here because we want to have access to this props parameter. So we're going to define another function in here to update the value just for that card that we're getting changed. I'm going to use an arrow function. So let's say const set card attribute is going to receive two parameters. The first one is going to be the value that we want to set, and the second one is going to be the index of the card that we are updating. And what this function, sorry, this should be equal. And what this function is going to do is first it's going to copy the value of the cards. So this is going to be props dot attributes dot cards, which is the name of the attribute that holds the value. Now you might be wondering why I'm doing this. What I'm doing here is basically creating another array that's a copy of the attributes.cards array, which is the arrays that holds our card text information, the content. Now, why am I copying the array? That is because when we're coding the React world, we cannot alter, we cannot modify the state of the application. We should always create a new state and change whatever value we want. Even we can change one value, every single value, just some of them in the new structure. We cannot change values on this state. So what I'm doing here, basically, what that means is that I cannot change the value in the props.attributes.cards array. I need to create a new one and change the value in that new array. This is just ES6 syntax to copy an array. Basically, this is unpackaging the array. So it creates like, it basically just enumerates each element, and we're putting all those elements inside a new array. There are other ways to do this. You could do something like new cards equals an empty array dot concat props dot attributes dot cards. This is basically doing the same thing. It's creating a new array and then concatenating the elements of another array, which generates a brand new array. I think this first option looks nicer and it's easier to read. It's just, you know, a new array with the same elements. So I'm going to leave that one. And what I'm going to do now is change the element that I need to change. So that would be new cards at that index dot content is going to be value. Now here's another thing. The array is holding objects, and the objects are references. So here, actually, I am changing the previous state, not the copy, because I'm copying the array, which copies references to objects, and then I'm changing a value inside one of those objects, which is the same original object. It's the same object in both arrays. So I need to change this line to actually say that at that position, I'm creating a new object. I could be doing this. I could say content is value. So I'm creating a new object and placing a reference to that object in the new array. This would be, you know, React approved Another thing I can do, which looks a little uglier, it's object.assign a new object and then new cards that index and then set the new content. What this is doing is creating a new object, then copying every key and value from this object into the new object, and then copying this key and value from this object into that sort of accumulating object, hence overriding the value of content. Now, I'm gonna leave this option. Why? Because this is more generic. I could even use a variable here instead of content to set whatever attribute I want, and later on we might do that. So I'm gonna leave this option here, even though it's longer than the first one. And lastly, what I want to do is set this new array on my attributes. So what I'm going to use is props.setAttributes, and now I can send the value of cards, which is new cards. So this looks like a lot of code just to do something very simple, but I am ensuring that the state is immutable. I'm setting a new state that is being persisted inside the attributes of my block. And the last thing I need to do here is when I get a new value called setCards attribute, I'm going to send the new value, and this is going to be index 1, and here this is going to be index 0. And with this, I should be able to change the content on my block and see the content that I am writing. I'm going to refresh this page. And here we go. Oh, we got an error. I forgot to... Actually, it's just a typo. Let's try again. Second time is sweeter. Yes. So now we can change the text. And now it's being reflected. That's all for now, and on the next video we're gonna go deeper in the development of this more complicated example, and we're gonna create another component that we're gonna use, and we're also gonna add some controls to position the text. And lastly, what we're gonna do is we still need to route this save function that is going to push the content into the post content. So there's a lot to do, there's a lot ahead of us, and I hope you're enjoying this video. If you have any questions, don't forget to add it on the comments, and see you in the next video.